Look up, and the sky appears to be an empty, boundless void. But that is a visual illusion. The air above the United States is actually a meticulously engineered, invisible, three-dimensional matrix. The Federal Aviation Administration divides this volume of sky into 6 active regulatory classes, designated A, B, C, D, E, and G. Your spatial location within these invisible boundaries instantly dictates your operational reality. Crossing a class line triggers strict entry prerequisites, demands specific pilot qualifications, requires mandatory communication equipment, and alters the legal limits of your weather visibility. The underlying logic of this architecture is mathematical. Regulatory restrictions scale in direct proportion to localized traffic density and the statistical risk of mid-air collisions. Pilots decode this complex system using a sectional aeronautical chart. As you can see on this map, the airspace is represented as a dense, two-dimensional web of intersecting blue and magenta lines, geographic intersections, and altitude floors. To navigate safely and ensure precise aircraft separation, a pilot has to translate this flat paper map into a durable, three-dimensional mental model. They must build the airspace architecture from the ground up. The foundation starts on the terrain. This ground-hugging layer is uncontrolled Class G airspace, where IFR aircraft maneuver freely without clearance. Above it sits Class E, the default controlled airspace filling the massive voids between terminal areas. The physical floor of Class E varies. It steps up and down across the map and drops all the way down to the surface around certain non-towered airports to safeguard incoming instrument approach traffic. On the chart, these exact floors are color-coded. A shaded magenta boundary dictates that Class E begins at 700 feet above the ground, while a shaded blue boundary pushes the controlled floor up to 1,200 feet. Within the vast expanse of Class E, the FAA carved out a dedicated substructure strictly for low-altitude routing, known as Victor Airways. These dedicated aerial highways are precisely 8 nautical miles wide, stretching from 1,200 feet AGL up to 18,000 feet NSL. To navigate safely, VFR traffic maintains rigid separation. Easterly flights fly odd thousands plus 500 feet. Westerly flights maintain even thousands. Class G and E provide the necessary matrix for general transit across the country. But as an aircraft nears a dense urban center, the baseline rules of Class E cannot process the influx of heavy traffic. This requires specialized terminal environments. The simplest of these is Class D airspace. Designed for local towered airports, Class D is a standardized blue dashed cylinder extending from the surface up to 2,500 feet. Before penetrating this volume, a pilot is legally obligated to establish two-way radio communications with the control tower. Because control relies on tower personnel, when a Class D facility closes at night, the immediate airspace reverts to the baseline rules of Class E. Scaling up, Class C airspace governs busier airports using radar approach control. Its geometry features 2 magenta tiers, a 5 nautical mile surface area beneath a 10 nautical mile outer shelf. Entry demands a Mode C transponder, continually sending precise altitude telemetry to controllers. The apex of the terminal environments is Class B airspace. It encloses the nation's busiest commercial hubs, managing the highest concentrations of large passenger aircraft. To encapsulate the heavy arrival and departure streams, Class B takes the form of an inverted wedding cake. It pairs a tight surface area with multiple larger radius layers stepping upward and outward, reaching a ceiling of 10,000 feet mean sea level. The barrier to entry is severe. Radio contact is insufficient. A pilot must secure an explicit verbal clearance before ever crossing the boundary line. The intensity of the traffic requires a private pilot certificate as the minimum baseline for entry. Student pilots are physically barred unless they carry a highly specific logbook endorsement authorizing flight at that exact airport. And alongside the clearance, an active Mode C transponder and two-way radio remain strict legal mandates. The progression from Class D to Class B outlines the FAA's logic. As an aircraft nears a major city, the volume of controlled airspace expands outward, and the regulatory friction required to enter increases proportionally to mitigate the extreme density risk. If an aircraft climbs out of the busy terminal areas and continues ascending, it hits the final structural boundary at 18,000 feet mean sea level. This initiates Class A airspace. It acts as a highly restrictive, opaque cap that spans the entirety of the United States, sealing the lower airspace and extending up to 60,000 feet. The definitive rule of Class A is absolute. Visual flight is illegal. Operations are restricted purely to instrument flight rules. To pierce that 18,000-foot ceiling, a pilot must hold an instrument rating and fly strictly under a mandatory air traffic control clearance. By stripping away all visual separation traffic, Class A removes unpredictable variables. The airspace relies on instrument precision to safely vector the intense volume of high-speed commercial and military jets crossing the continent. The standard A through G matrix dictates civilian flight, but it is frequently interrupted by special use airspace, designed to trap unique hazards and dynamic restrictions. Prohibited areas restrict all flight entirely to shield national security assets, while restricted areas signify lethal hazards, blocking access around active artillery firing or guided missile tests. The military also utilizes military operations areas. These carve out deep sections of sky to isolate erratic, high-speed military aerobatics from steady civilian instrument traffic. Civilian visual flight pilots can technically enter an active MOA without requesting a clearance, though they are expected to exercise extreme caution while navigating through it. Military aircraft also transition via low-altitude military training routes. These are explicitly numbered for pilot awareness. Routes exclusively below 1,500 feet above ground level use 4-digit identifiers, while routes containing segments above 1,500 feet switch to 3-digit identifiers. Beyond these permanent structures, the FAA deploys temporary flight restrictions, or TFRs. These are dynamic, short-notice airspace closures, activated by an official notice to airmen. A TFR can seal off airspace over a disaster relief zone, a dense firefighting operation, or project a moving, restricted bubble around VIP presidential movements. These special zones and temporary blocks function as absolute overrides to the standard airspace topology, prioritizing immediate safety protocols over routine flight routing. The physical boundaries of these airspace classes link hardware requirements to the physiological limits of visual flight, specifically VFR weather minimums. In controlled airspace like classes C, D, and E, operating below 10,000 feet requires strict adherence to baseline visual flight minimums. A pilot must maintain 3 statute miles of flight visibility and keep the airframe exactly 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and a full 2,000 feet horizontally away from any cloud formation. But the second an aircraft ascends across the 10,000-foot altitude threshold, those regulatory requirements instantly jump. The thin air at high altitudes facilitates drastically higher true airspeeds. This increased closure rate severely reduces the time a pilot has to visually spot and dodge an oncoming hazard. To compensate for the speed, the safety bubble inflates. Above 10,000 feet, visibility minimums increase to 5 statute miles, and the required distance expands to 1,000 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and a full statute mile horizontally from clouds. The primary exception to these wide clearances occurs back down in the uncontrolled Class G airspace, where daytime limits can contract to just 1 mile of visibility and simply remaining clear of the clouds. The National Airspace System is a highly structured, volumetric environment. By defining their precise, 3-dimensional position within this matrix, a pilot immediately knows the regulations governing their compliance and the parameters required for their survival.